Good afternoon. I'm Denise Simmons, Cambridge City Councilor, former mayor, and I want to welcome you to COVID-19 Policing Black Cambridge. It's great to be with you this afternoon. I want to just start by thanking our host, CCTV, for making it possible for us to have these community conversations. We are at our 8th community conversation on topics that are pertinent to the Black community, particularly during this time of COVID-19. As many of you've known by watching the television and in your own communities, what's been going on relative to policing and in our country, not only in our city, but in our country. And we thought it'd be really important to have a series of conversations around policing and policing in Cambridge in particular. I'm proud and pleased to be joined by my co-host and her charming assistant this afternoon, Manikka Bowman. As you know, Manikka is the vice chair of the Cambridge School Committee, has been working tirelessly on the school committee around a variety of issues. And in fact, just recently, our last episode of this program, we had a cross-municipal conversation, which I think was the first of any kind. It was an extraordinary conversation. And I bring it up because you can go to the CCTV archive and see that series, as you'll be also be able to see this series of 24 hours after it posts. But let me turn it over to my colleague, my friend, and co-moderator, Manikka Bowman. Manikka?
Denise, yes. Today is going to be an interesting day for us with the program because I do have my co-host here, Ms. Zyla. But this is, I guess, the quintessential moment of what community television is, right? With a little one here on the set with us today. I'm elated to have the conversation about policing, particularly in this moment after our nation and our community and the city of Cambridge is struggling over the recent verdict in the context of Breonna Taylor. So there's so much to discuss, so much to talk about, and I'm elated to be able to continue these conversations with you. So let's get to it.
Thank you, Zyla, for your remarks. It's great to have two individuals from Cambridge, one longtime resident of Cambridge, a good friend, neighbor, community advocate, Dr. MARION Darlington-HOPE. MARION, as I briefly mentioned, has lived in Cambridge her entire life, but she's had an extraordinary career, particularly around equal rights, civil rights, and equal justice. And so I'm going to turn to her just for a moment to allow her to introduce herself by way of what she's done in our community. And then we're going to go to our next panelist, Brian CORR. So MARION, tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're interested in this particular topic.
Well, the reason why I am interested in this particular topic is that which I'll talk a little bit about later, but I was part of the committee. I was on a former police advisory board under Commissioner Haas, and I was on the committee that reviewed the arrest of Professor Henry Louis Gates in 2009, along with a number of other people. And so I've continued to sort of and carefully as we're trying to sort of figure out what's the next step in our policing. As I said, I attended public schools in Cambridge, the high school. As in my career, I taught both at UMass Boston, and I was part of that criminal justice faculty. And I also taught at Lesley University. Currently, I'm a trustee in the Cambridge Health Alliance. And so although I'm no longer actively working, I help out with grandchildren, and I'm on the 19th Amendment, the Suffragette Committee. So I'm still active in Cambridge.
And I'm so glad to have you with us, MARION. The work that you've done and the work that you continue to do is all very important to Cambridge. And very importantly, though, I'm very happy to have you here. Also with us today is Brian CORR. Brian CORR is a longtime Cambridge resident, very active in Massachusetts state party politics, as well as a number of things that he does for our city, which is I'm going to try to say this right, he is the executive secretary of the Civilian Review Board, as well as the executive director of the Peace Commission. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Brian, and why you think this is an important discussion.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Councilor Simmons. And also thank you to both you and Vice Chair Bowman for asking me to be part of this program today. So you did get it basically right. It's complicated. I may just start calling myself the director of both the Peace Commission and the Police Review and Advisory Board. But my day-to-day work at the City of Cambridge involves both work with the Peace Commission, which is everything from sister cities to commemorations to responding to traumatic events that occur that have an impact on the community. And then the Police Review and Advisory Board is the city's civilian oversight agency that receives and takes and investigates complaints regarding the Cambridge Police Department, also looks at policies and procedures. And I come to this work, I've been working for the city since 2008, but before that, I was the first field organizer ever hired by the ACLU of Massachusetts. And in that role, I was working to organize civil liberties task forces around the state, including one in Lawrence, which was specifically focused on police misconduct. At that point, there were some very serious issues within the Latino community around police misconduct and specifically police brutality against Latinos in that city. Unfortunately, a very complicated political situation. Civilian oversight was not formed in that city, but it really gave me a leg up when I started doing the work at the City of Cambridge. And then I also got involved in the national level soon after I took on the civilian oversight in 2010. So I've spent now 9 years, I believe, on the board of the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. And I spent 3 years, each year I had to run and get elected as president. So in that role, as I still serve on the board, I've done work with communities all across the United States, even with communities in Canada and Mexico. Last year, I got to go to a conference in Mexico to talk about civilian oversight. So I both have the experience right here in Cambridge where I've seen the changes in the Cambridge Police Department. I've seen that through complaints and collaboration, but I also am able to see things from the national level and have done just in the last month work with Madison, Wisconsin, Santa Barbara, California, Columbus, Ohio, Newark, New Jersey. So I hope to be able to share some of that in our limited time together.
And I appreciate that because, you know, oftentimes we think of nationally about what's going on and apply that locally, whether it fits or doesn't fit. And so I hope you'll be able to sort of add some of your knowledge and your expertise and what you've been exposed to nationally to be a part of this conversation. So the title we have with us today is Policing Black Cambridge. And one of the things that I think is important is not to just dive into the topic, but kind of provide some context. And for me, the context is, what is policing from a historical perspective? Everyone has a different view of it. Like, when did it start? How did we even get this thing called policing? And Brian, I'm going to lean into you here as someone who has done a little research on the history of policing to kind of give us an overview. How did we come to this thing called policing? So I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you again. You know, in the current moment, I'll just use that phrase as shorthand, we're hearing a lot about policing coming out of slave catching, and there is real absolute truth to that. But as with many, the truth is more complicated than one single story. So in the United States, there is absolutely that history. You think about the 1619 Project and all of the information that people have started to focus on around 400 years of people of African descent being held in bondage in this country and the aftermath, which we live with today. And the origins of policing definitely include that. The designation of people as different races, giving people different rights, responsibilities, burdens, obligations, and different laws impacting people. That led to slave patrols and slave catching. And that was not just in the South where people were being held in bondage, but also in the North. Many people have seen that famous poster, Colored Men of Boston, Beware, which is from only about 160 years ago. And there's a whole other path. Now, you'll hear a lot about this if we talk to people from, say, law enforcement or criminology. The history of policing in England, where you had night watch and constables and really neighbors looking out for each other, you know, hark, who goes there? And then the evolution into kind of official policing with Sir Robert Peel leading the formation of the Metropolitan Police Department in London in 1829. So you'll hear a lot about Sir Robert Peel is principles of policing. The one you will often hear, which again, there's real truth to this, is the idea that the police are the public and the public are the police. That police are simply individuals who've been given a special responsibility to focus on what is everyone's responsibility, and that is to keep the peace. So those origins of peace officers, of keeping the peace, are inextricably linked in this country with the idea of slave patrols and catching people and bringing them back to their, quote, owners, end quote. So we have to understand both of these things. And as we look at the history of policing in the North, certainly there's a lot of history around police being used to keep unions from being formed, to stop strikes, to keep ethnic communities from organizing and practicing their cultures and faiths in many cases. And we also have that idea of the police officer walking the beat, who knows all the neighbors, who's friends with everybody, that when something goes wrong, you go up to Officer Friendly and say, hey, I need help. And if we don't understand both of those streams of history, it's very difficult to have conversations. And we have conversations where we talk past each other because person A's narrative is all about how the police are just part of the community. And person B's narrative is how what they experience today is a direct descendant of the slave catching that threatened their ancestors. So that's why I say we have to keep in mind as we think about that. And as we look at the history of policing just here in Massachusetts, Boston was the first major city to form a police department, again, with these complicated origins. Cambridge's police department goes back almost as long to the 1850s. And as we know, it was a very long time before people who were not white and were not men were allowed to be police officers. When they first allowed women to become police officers, they were clerical and giving out parking tickets, and people of color were in many cities. Cambridge, I don't know the exact history in terms of people of color's assignments, but in many cities, for example, Miami, where there's a whole museum devoted to the colored police precinct, police were hired specifically to take care of their own people, with this idea that, well, they understand them, so we'll let them deal with their own problems under our direction. There's a lot of complicated history. And I won't jump ahead because I know we'll talk about events in Cambridge over the last 10 to 20 years soon, but that history is always evolving. And yet everyone knows pieces of that history. People pass that history down through families, through friendships. So people know about what happened to their neighbor and their grandparents and their great-great-grandparents and people who looked like them, who lived and died 300 years ago. So I would say that's the history of policing that we all must keep in mind as we think about how do we create policing that is responsive to the needs of our community and really does what we want it to do.
Thanks, Brian. When you were talking about how policing came to Cambridge, Cambridge in a lot of ways, and Marion has heard me say this a lot, I've called it America's classroom, where we take an issue comes up, we take that issue, we look at it, and we try to learn from it, and then give that education and spread it across our own community, but also other cities and towns have the ability of using it as well. And I think about in terms of history in Cambridge and even policing. By the way, I even came to the city of Cambridge just through an organization that doesn't quite exist, but it does have a committee that works, which is the Civic Unity Committee. And the Civic Unity Committee was one of many across the country. And ours, which was established in 1945, interesting enough, did take up the issue of communities and the police. And that was like 95 years from the time policing was started in Cambridge. 95 years later, in 1945, we put together it was initially called the Citizens Committee for Civic Unity, and then the Civic Unity Committee later. Then again, in 1950, they did some more work around policing in the city. Moved forward to 1990, we started having conversations around policing in the city. And then we had that opportunity to really apply some introspection when we had that event between Officer Crowley and Dr. Henry Louis Gates. And this is where I kind of bring you into it, Marion. You had talked about something that's you said, Brian, the police are the public and the public are the police. And in this instance, you became the public that were sort of looking at what the police were doing and how what happened, what can we do to make it better? Because I often say when it comes to issues of race relations, and all things similar, we're on the road, but we're not there yet. And so can you talk to us a little bit about that, Marion, about that experience, being appointed to that committee, and what your understanding of policing was, what you've learned, and how you think we came out on the other end?
Sure, thank you. What's interesting is I was reviewing the notes from that time, and I recognized that this is over a decade, right? The arrest happened in July 2009.
Yes.
And now it's 9. So I just want to spend a minute giving a little bit of the story and the narrative of what happened. So saying that it looked like two men were breaking into a house near Harvard Square. Officer Crowley answered the call. And as it turned out, it was Professor Gates. And basically he had just come back from a long trip. They were trying to get into the house. They had gotten in, and Officer Crowley knocked on the door and asked for Professor Gates to step outside. Professor Gates said no, but he wanted to come in because, and from as I remember from what he said, was that it had tall windows. So if there were other people and they got a call, the city had gotten a call that it was two men. So Officer Crowley steps in. There are words that pass between them, and I'm not going to go into the who said, she said, but when left, Professor Gates went outside, some more words passed, and then Professor Gates was arrested. The case was dropped and all of that, but I think it made national attention. And as I remember, it was Commissioner Ramsey from Philadelphia who was on the committee, said, you know, if this wasn't Professor Gates and if this had happened in my city, we would have said, and what else is new? So the fact that it got such attention, I think, is really what sort of made this a significant event, because it was Professor Henry Louis Gates. It wasn't you, it wasn't me. Who had some choice words with an officer. The committee spent a good part of a year really sort of looking at what the situation happened. And so it was more than this who said she. I do believe we learned a lot about the work of police and how individuals perceive officers and the work of the police. So we, in addition to having two citywide meetings, I and John Crosco, who was also a Cambridge resident and a superintendent in the state, went to different neighborhood organizations, you know, the Cambridge Port Committee. I went to the Area 4 Coalition, of which I was part of because I lived in the neighborhood, and heard from people about their own experience with the police. And I would say that one of the key things that I came away with is how significant an interaction with a police officer can be, both devastating, you know, there was one person there, he was in his mid-60s, simply, you know, had an altercation with the police at age 13. Talked about it vividly in that meeting. And we also heard from people who said how an officer had saved their life, that this officer who patrolled their community saw that they were sort of moving in the wrong path and actually supported them, talked to them. And so, you know, they didn't get into some trouble that they might have, but it was important regardless of, and they were both people of color, there were of different ethnic backgrounds, different income backgrounds, but we really heard how important and how traumatizing an interaction with the police happened. As a result of this, I mean, I think that we produced a document, it's entitled and it's still available, Missed Opportunities, Shared Responsibilities. And one of the things that we came to, I think it was the sort of first issue, that the actual incident avoided. It wasn't doomed that it needed to happen, that the arrest could have been avoided. But if we talk about shared responsibility, both Professor Gates and Officer Crowley made some choices that moved them into an arrest. So I'm going to look closely at my note here that I have on this, because as a result, there was a policy that was a major policy change, so that Professor Gates was arrested on disorderly conduct, so that there would not be an arrest if the only target of the disorderly conductor is the officer, which is often described as being arrested for contempt of cop. So if it's just the officer and the individual, there won't be any arrest. And when you think about that, for most of us, our arrest or citation or warning is really and so there are alternatives to arresting. And so to change that policy, even though it seems insignificant, it was an area that if there needs to be an arrest, then it has to be clear. But contempt of cop being used as disorderly conduct is no longer acceptable, and then that was the major policy change. And there were certainly recommendations in the report, meaning that we need to both work with the MIT and Harvard police, because Professor Gates was actually living on Harvard property. You know, there were things, training both police officers and the community. And I don't know how much of the training of the community about de-escalating conflicts and situations. So I think we learned a lot, both about the perception, and there were two things I think that was important more than, and we had a wonderful professor from Yale Law who talked about both procedural justice and legitimacy. And that if I'm going to get a ticket, it's really equally as important to me how I'm being treated in conversation with that officer about what I had done wrong or whatever, that how I'm treated. If I'm treated respectfully, I'm much more likely to be accepting of the ticket or the warning or the citation than if I'm yelled at, not treated well. Then we stop looking at the actual problem and more focus on how this officer treated me. And I think that was one of the things that we recognize is important, because people expect to be treated respectfully. And the second was the issue of legitimacy, which that even if the officer is completely within its rights, that if it's his being seen as legitimate, that there is some built-in bias there, then if it's not seen as legitimate, people are not going to obey or follow it or listen because they don't respect the officer's legitimacy, hence the police department's legitimacy. I think in general, I think no city is perfect, and we've done a lot. And so some of the questions I've heard nationally, I think as we go beyond this conversation to the city, that we need to really look at what we are doing, because I think you're right. We are the America's classroom, and there's a lot that we can share with other parts of the country who haven't even thought about a number of the things that we're doing. So, but that I think was an important change for the city, even though it was maybe a small policy in retrospect in terms of bigger issues and that it changed some of the dynamics between individual officers and the public.
Thanks, Marion. I see my co-host, co-moderator, Manikka wants to kind of get into this conversation a little. Some of your thoughts, Manikka, on this, on all of it.
Yeah, and Zyla will be she will be my amen corner, so bear with me, everyone. But I think it's really interesting when I hear Brian and what I hear Marion saying. It's there's this conversation that needs to happen, particularly in the moment of this conversation regarding defunding the police, that's connected to an institution and individuals. So when it comes to individuals, this is where I think you have this groundswell when people recognize that from an individual basis, that there has historically been a system that was designed to undermine our existence. And how do you take individual incidents and turn it into a moment that then transforms an institution? And I think across the country, in municipalities and cities, which we live in, are really struggling to figure out how do you bridge that. The conversation, of course, has emerged to, defund the police. That's one part of the conversation, and I appreciate the work of the ACLU and the work that they're doing to really dig into that and look at it from a policy lens, recognizing that the institution of policing is not unique to the United States at all. Like every country, even African nations, have these systems in place to maintain peace and order, and how individuals then operationalize them is really the challenge. How do you hold systems to a higher standard that then will allow those systems to truly serve people? And we know as Black folks that those systems have never served us well. So what is the conversation, and how do we, as a community, really gather people for this really is an intersectional conversation around institutions and the impact that it has on individuals that can position us to truly have the systematic change that we want?
I think that's a great question. I look to Dr. Hope and to Mr. CORR. I mean, what are your thoughts about that? Because part of why we're here, and part of why I wanted to have this conversation with Manikka and I, was how do we have that conversation? I mean, I always think it's important to find out where you've been. How did policing start? And that's why I started with that. And I thank you. And to have a little bit of a conversation about some of the things that we've tried to impose when we were presented with the problem. But the bigger question is, we have to have this conversation. And how do we do that? And how do we do that? And my favorite way is to say is authentically. How do we hear from those voices that don't get heard from? Because in a COVID environment where you can't come into the city hall, where you can't go as Marion, as you went around the city, eliciting and soliciting people's thoughts and perspectives, where you could go to the senior citizen buildings, where you could go to the high school. How are we going to have that conversation that's so important to be rich, authentic, and purposeful? I throw that out to either of you.
Yeah. Well, I can start. I think one thing that's really important as I look at this whole range of work, including civilian oversight, law enforcement in general, and governance, is so often by necessity we're responding, but it can easily be a reaction. And so if we're reacting, we're trying to do back-end accountability. We say, okay, something went wrong, we have to figure it out and hold people accountable. And that's often necessary. But increasingly, I think we need to focus on front-end accountability. How can we proactively look at, and I think as both of you were just saying, how do we determine what the needs are of the community and have an authentic conversation? And there's some really interesting things going on right now. Harvard Kennedy School is starting to look at how do we rethink this idea of policing and all the functions that police and law enforcement play in our society. As we do that, we certainly need to do fact finding. Right now, we talk about Cambridge. We are really a model in many ways. In fact, the work that the committee that MARION was on, led to, in a very direct way, the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, with Professor Tracy Mears from Yale, with Charles Ramsey. And that led to a whole national blueprint on how to change policing. So we really can have an impact. And as we think about looking at this concept of defunding, which we already know means lots of different things to different people, what's the formal process to guide the work? With all due respect to our elected officials and as a city employee, I think it's got to be more than policy orders. It's got to be a whole plan where we have a formal process, that we begin to understand the needs of our specific community, that we understand what the police are already doing and how they've responded to the ever-growing demands on policing as our society has defunded social services and mental health and other things. What has our police department in particular done to address that? Many departments haven't. Ours has done some of that work. After we gather that information, we have to reimagine. We have to really think about what is true community safety? What does it really mean? What would it mean for people to feel in their homes, when they walk down the street, that they are truly safe? Where are the gaps? What are the things we need to make that possible? And once we kind of get that lay of the land, then we can really talk about refining and reprioritizing. We can talk about what does it look like to provide the services that create true public safety in our community. And that's a long-term project. So to slightly borrow from a phrase of one of my favorite elected officials, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, change can't wait, but sustainable change takes time.
Absolutely. Marion, Dr. Hope, did you want to add anything to that answer or that question?
Yes, a couple of things I think that are important. I know some of the programs that the police have done in the past, so I haven't been involved in the last sort of 4 to 5 years at all, but I think these are programs that are done sort of with a few people. The way they may reach out to youth, or the way they may reach out, and a lot of the public doesn't know they even exist.
Mm-hmm.
So it would not be uncommon for someone to complain, or lots of people to complain about something that they think needs to be done, just to find out that the police has already started working in that area. That might really mean there are ways of improving what they're doing, not just sharing what they're doing, but improving what they're doing. Because I may have the greatest idea in the world on how to serve youth, or serve the elderly, or to keep particular populations safe. But if the public is not part of the conversation, then it's really something that the institution, the police department, is imposing on us, even if it's for all the right reasons. And so what I think beyond the sort of outreach is that the next we sort of decide as we go through this process needs to be shared. I mean, that's why the part of the title talked about shared responsibility, that safety is not only the police department's responsibility. We are all responsible for safety in our neighborhoods. And so they have a particular role to play, but we need to think about how we're in this together. I think policing still needs to change. I mean, there are different views about sort of policing. When that policy was changed as the result of the Gates case, there were a number of officers who felt that it undermined their authority, that by not being able to sort of make an arrest or to, in that way, undermine their ability to do their job. Well, nothing could be further from the truth, because if I don't perceive that work is legitimate, I'm not going to obey. I'm going to fight it. And so I think that the conversations have to happen both ways and together, not with, different officials from different departments. I know that the police work closely with the Department of Human Services, but with the leadership of those, I think that beyond getting our perspective, we then need to come back and work together on what some of the solutions are. The other thing I think is important, which sometimes get lost, and maybe because it's my age showing now, that I get concerned when the dominant language and forces are coming from people who are here for 3, 4, 5, 6 years before whatever next. I mean, we know that we are a city where people come and go. We have universities, many people have their first professional job in the city. So first professional job, and they may not stay. All kinds of reasons. We're expensive and all of that. But the fact is, I think there are voices that don't get heard who've been here for a long time. And there may not be the most vociferous voice that's in terms of the conversation, but we need to reach out so we can have dialogue and not just presentations and not just getting input, but true dialogue where the words between us, that we are engaged in language where we're hearing each other and can then move on that to actually doing not just policy, but real directions that actually engage practice for both residents and and the police department and human services and schools, because we are all in this collectively.
And you brought up, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could just jump in right quick, because I definitely value and appreciate that perspective of, folks that's been here for a really long time. And sometimes, the way in which these community conversations happens, it creates the divide between like who's a part of the community, right? And so like, how do we then have these conversations, recognizing that, there are people that are going to be here for a short amount of time and then they're gone. And policing impacts them too while they're here, right? And then it lays the foundation for those folks that's then coming behind them, which will have an impact, as well as the people that's been here for a really long time, like 3, 4, 5 generations. And, how do we structure these conversations in a way where those voices and how they interact with the system can shape policing in a way that makes the whole city better, in essence?
And I think that is,
And if I can, sorry. If I can jump in, I think that what both of you, Manikka and Marion, have just said are really great points, because as we think about how we do this kind of work in the city, I mean, we're always challenged with outreach, and we all are familiar with the public meeting where the same 20 people and you pretty much can say what they're going to say, and that's important, but we need to get beyond those voices. And I think the other piece that really hopefully speaks to what you were just saying, Manikka, is that, yeah, it's very true. All voices are valuable. And while we need to have people that speak from experience and understand what's happening, and people who are talking about what they've lived through themselves, we also have to, I think, move from positions to what it is we want to see. And I think that for me is the biggest challenge about so many of these conversations we're having around policing, is people come into the conversation saying policing is this and policing is that, and this is what's happening and this needs to change, instead of saying what's happening here in this community, is it meeting our needs? And if not, how do we change things so that people get the policing that they need and want and deserve, and in general, the kind of public safety and services they need, want, and deserve?
let's dig down to that a little bit, because part of the conversations that Manikka and I have been hosting through CCTV has been an attempt to reach out to the larger community at a time when you can't go to again, City Hall, your school, your church, to have a conversation or have your thoughts elicited. Let's spend a little time. What would it look like? As we continue this conversation, the very next conversation that we're going to be having in October around policing in Cambridge, what would you say are some of the tools that we could use to engage people that are not well versed with using technology or don't have good technology? I mean, they're not on the information highway. They're on the back road of the information highway and don't have real good access, because it's going to be a while, I suspect, before we're going to be able to do in-person conversations. So, I mean, even to my my co-moderator, because we grappled on this issue as elected officials. You said it, Brian, you can almost tell who's going to sign up for public comment before public comment opens, regardless of the issue. I know for our public meetings, but we know the issues before us are important to everybody. So how do you do it? Thoughts?
I'll jump in. I know that I think about community engagement, at least in my role as a school committee member, from like 3 different levels of engagement. There's the voices that I know will come to a public meeting, and I hold those voices and I listen to those voices. And then there are the people that's engaged, but they're not going to come to a meeting. They, they're reading through, the papers, the blogs, and, have an opinion. They'll email their elected officials to let them know what their thoughts are. And so I log those. And then there's this cohort that I call the silent majority. Mm-hmm. And I think those folks really depend on the leadership of people like all of us to really be able to be engaged, because they don't have the time. Like, I mean, they're probably like me right now, right? Doing this and trying to figure out, how do you manage your life and all the complexities of it. And then there's this extra demand that people want you to then get engaged and get involved when you're stretched really thin already. And that's why we have an electoral process. So those voices can be heard through whether it is a commission, a board, or an elected official. And so that's one way I kind of try to interpret or understand the complexities of community engagement, and I try not to shame those folks that can't come out, because it's hard. Like, life is really hard right now. And so we have to think creatively about how do we include voices when we know that everybody, just because of the complexities of COVID, may not even have the energy or the will to show up. And how do we then make sure that we create space for diversity of perspective? I often say there's no one community. There are multiple communities within a community.
Yeah.
But I'm always leery when someone says, well, the community said this. Well, that's one portion of the community. So we have to make sure that we are always thinking about the multiple voices, because those multiple voices create the whole of the city of Cambridge.
Right. And this program focuses primarily on Black community in COVID-19. And so to each of our panelists thinking about the Black community, how do we, reach out and get our community to come out and to render their opinion to not only the elected bodies, but let's specific to this topic, because we're the ones that have the most to gain and to lose by our lack of participation. So I'd just like to, either of your thoughts on how do we do that, because we're looking forward to this conversation that's coming up in October. And I know for myself, and I think I can speak for my co-moderator, we don't want it to be more of what we already have. So I would just be interested in some of your thoughts. And then I have another question that is focused at you, Manikka, about our school-based police. But so think about that for a moment. But to Marion and Brian, I often say, and I'm sure you've heard me say it ad nauseum, how do we get the authentic voices? As Manikka says, and she's absolutely right. There's the proactive and the reactive. The proactive, you don't even have to call them. They'll just show up. The reactive are the ones that are going to respond to something, a problem. And although we're in a crisis, it's not maybe hot enough to get people, they'll come to the street, but not to a policy making or discussion based program that is organized around trying to solve the problem. So in your ideal world, or in your ideal world, what would you think might help us get to some of those authentic voices? I just throw that open to both of you. Marion, do you want to start out? I think Marion's frozen. So Brian, while she
there she's back. Yes, go ahead, Marion.
No, what I said says my connection is unstable. That's the little note that I just got. So I'll see how far I can get with this. I would say we go where people go. The problem is right now we're not going anywhere. I mean, because we have institutions. I mean, people go to churches, people go to different groups and clubs and places where people hang out, but nobody seems to be able to hang out anywhere. So I'm really a little bit stumped about how, if we begin to have this conversation next month, how we're going to be able to reach populations that aren't going to react or are going to be proactive, who are going to sort of not be happy about what's going on, but they're not necessarily. I've seen CCTV on Facebook. I know a bunch of folks hang out on Facebook, but it's not clear to me the best avenue when I think moving around right now is not easy. I mean, places that people use for the internet, like the library and in my neighborhood, the Margaret Fuller Neighborhood House, those those places aren't open in the same way. They're doing sort of minimal work to avoid problems regarding COVID-19, but we do need to continue, even if it means that we begin to have a conversation and we don't come to any conclusions until we really have decided that we really have heard. Brian, I don't know what you may have to offer.
Brian?
No, well, thank you. So this is something I think about a lot for many different reasons, from my personal life to my work life to my political life. And I think, without getting too millennial, because I'm not really a millennial at all, I think part of the challenge is that we have these structures that go back to parliaments and corporate governance, right? So we think of things in terms of public meetings, spaces, agendas, a certain set time, everyone gets to speak as long as you're comfortable getting up and standing at the mic. And we've all been in those rooms where we see, again, not to belabor a point, the same people speak or people who look the same. And so many people who look like the four of us, who are African American, African descent, what we have learned over our lives and perhaps generations is, even when we show up, what we want doesn't happen. That somehow the people who are very concerned about very specific issues in their neighborhoods, which may be more wealthy, or the people who have graduate degrees are more listened to. And so I think we have to recognize, even though we don't have a great substitute, that our typical public process is pretty limiting. It's pretty tailored for well-educated, articulate, mostly white people, generally men, but not always, who like to get up and talk and are extroverted. And, you know, those people often have really great ideas, but it means that lots of other people's ideas don't get discussed. And a lot of people feel that those things aren't for them. How many parents have gone to a school night or some other activity, and you go there and you see that people don't really look like you, they all seem to know each other, you know, they've all brought fancy baked goods that they're help them prepare, and they're looking down at you because you've got some Dunkin' Donuts munchkins that you felt really good because you were able to jump in there and bring those, you know. And it might be because you're really busy, it might be because you're juggling 2 jobs, or it might just be because, you know what, no one seems to respect what I have to say, so I'm not going again. So it's a long-winded answer, but it's ultimately, for me, the point is that we have to find ways to, as some of you have also said, reach people where they are, but find different ways to talk to people. Maybe we have to do phone surveys. Maybe we just have to call up people and try to get a representative sample and have a conversation with them. Not what's wrong with your life, what's wrong with policing, but what do you expect? What do you need? You know, really explore with people what they want. And then from that place, start to develop some more ideas and strategies. And again, it's probably a longer term process than we've got 3 public meetings, and at the end of it, we're going to make decisions as a community. It's got to be something where we really engage with people and hear their experience and then build on that. And again, if I had all the answers, you know, I would be out there selling books on TV. I'd be a multi-billionaire. But I think that these are some of the things I've seen that can make a difference as we try to have authentic voices that really represent the breadth of the people that live in all of our communities in Cambridge.
I think the ideas that you mentioned are actually very good ones. It's calling on a little bit of what we've done in the past, but also retooling it. I know oftentimes when we do get people together, they are, as you say, they all look the same, talk the same, and act the same, and they're making decisions for people that are not in the room. And we always fall back on that. And maybe if we're really going to be in earnest about having this conversation, it's going to be more than even coming together in a Skype, Zoom, or all the 5,000 different platforms that are emerging that you can get together to have conversations to get to people. But one thing I know that we have not done, I thought was fairly interesting, was I don't think we do phone surveys. And that might be, you know, Cambridge certainly has the money to say, this is who we want to hear from. And I want you to make sure you've talked to X number of these folks or next X number of people in this neighborhood, so that we are getting a broader idea what people's concerns are. So I think it's a start. And we may have to have more conversations so we actually come up with a plan.
Yeah, you know, Denise, I think that, you know, from my side, from a school committee perspective, and I can roll this into the conversation around resource officers if you want to, but what I found interesting, particularly in the context of COVID, You know, for the 5 years I've been on the committee, you know, it's really the people that show up. It's really the loudest voices, regardless of like who those loudest voices are. So if you're a loud voice, 9 times out of 10, you're going to get what you want. Period. That's what it is. And I've always struggled with that. And so what's been really interesting for me is because of COVID, we've been forced to do such a deeper level of community engagement that it did not simply rest on whoever showed up to our meetings. Like, we did those surveys. We had to, in order to engage family voices, and we had data sets in a way that allowed us to have a different type of conversation. And those conversations, to be really honest and very frank, you know, they were at odds at times with what was happening in our public meeting. And I thought that that was a good thing because it gave us the space to have a diversity of thoughts and conversations that did not simply lie on the people that showed up. So the question is, as a community, you know, how do we then prioritize, whether it's on the city council or school committee side, you know, how do we prioritize those issues? Because it's not actually practical for every single policy order to have a deep dive survey to go out to the community. That is not practical. And so, you know, how do we then really get razor focused when it comes to this issue of policing and community engagement, where we understand that these are the levers that we want to have conversations around that will then galvanize the public and meet them where they are. I think that's a huge tension when it comes to serving at the municipal level, whether that's being an employee or, you know, being an elected official, to be honest about that.
I think you raised an important question. The issue at hand for the school department in this context was, how are we going to educate our kids? And that was the core question. And how are you going to engage? So you had that laser focus. It was around educating kids. The second thing that I thought you just said was very important was, here were the policymakers saying, well, this is what we think, given what we do and what we know. And then you got survey information that said, well, that's not quite what I want. And so if you look at policing, and then one question that came up to my cell phone was the difference between policing and public safety. But when you talk about policing, if we put that question out there and say, well, what does that look like to you, in a series of other questions, we might find it's in conflict with what we're offering, because we for whatever reason, we've been doing this too long, or because we're blindsided by what we do and who we talk to and who we spend our time with, and what the community, the public are really needing. One question that did come up was, what is the difference, and this may be a Brian question, what is the difference between, if you can answer it, policing and public safety? Because we use those words interchangeably. Can you speak to that at all, Brian?
No, absolutely. That's a really great question. So there's like many things, we've all seen those Venn diagrams with the overlapping circles. So you've got policing, which involves certain things, and patrolling is often a subset of that. And again, patrol has many implications: walking a beat, driving around, checking for intruders. Policing can be policing people's behavior. It could be in a potentially positive way. Maybe now, again, not everyone agrees with how this is perceived, but let's say you think about my understanding of the homeless outreach officers that work in Central Square. They have personal relationships with people. They know people. They can go up and they can police them by saying, hey, what's going on with you? You seem out of sorts today. Hey, how come you guys are getting into it? What's going on with you two? That's a form of policing. Now, then there's law enforcement. So law enforcement is it says what it is. It's enforcing the law. There's a law, people are breaking it, they're not following it, you're telling them they need to follow it, don't step across that line or you'll break the law. And then public safety is a whole different thing. So obviously it involves more than just policing and law enforcement. It involves fire prevention and suppression, it involves EMTs, it may involve, in a lot of places, different social services, all sorts of things. So when we think about public safety, there's a whole range of things that we need to do. But from my perspective, if we think about policing and law enforcement within that framework of public safety, then the goal is how do we ensure we have a peaceful and just community? When we're looking at law enforcement, the goal is how do we ensure that the law is followed? When we're looking at policing, it's like, how do we ensure that we're addressing problems and keeping problems from arising? So they're all related, but they're all different. And I think that's part of why the conversation in our society is so complicated right now, because people think they're all talking about the same thing, but some people are talking about policing, some are talking about law enforcement, some are talking about patrol, and some are talking about, social services and helping people who need help.
Excellent, excellent. Other thoughts? Because we are just about to round up to the 2:00 hour. I want to pose a question that did come up, Marion sort of cued it, and then someone else followed up. Marion, in your earlier conversation, you said when you participated in what ended up being shared responsibilities, I'm going to mess it up, I do it every time, in that report, it talked about what kinds of things that we would do, and you found in those discussions some of the things we were doing, but no one knew about it. And I bring that up because something that came to me, as we all know, Rashawn Hall with the ACLU is doing some work and has sent out a letter asking for support around how we reform policing, as well as Segund from BECMA also was working, BECMA being the Black Economic Coalition of Massachusetts, also had a piece of work around policing. And what was interesting in one of them, and this is to you, Manikka, it talks about local control over school resource officers. And it's interesting, it goes on to say, we know that police presence in schools disproportionately impact Black children. Short of requiring the removal of police from schools, you should at least allow the school district superintendents to determine whether or not police should be assigned to local schools. We've been doing that for a very long time. And if you could just speak to that, how's that been working? What do you feel are our students' feelings around law enforcement officers in our schools?
Right. I'm gonna try to answer this without a baby crying in the background. Let's go. So, we've had a partnership with the Cambridge Police Department for quite a while now. And our resource officers have really been viewed in our community as an asset. And they're in our communities, not necessarily, it goes back to that conversation or what Brian mentioned around, how do we define policing, but it's really a community engagement opportunity. And I know a lot of our resource officers have built very deep relationships with some of our students, as well as families that go beyond even our school, the work that happens within our schools. And so I think that going back to just being, committed to my principles, I think that if we're going to go to a point where we have a conversation about removing them, I think that's where that survey comes in. I think we need to go to the families that have been impacted by our resource officers, the students that have engaged our resource officers, and hear how that program has impacted them before we then make a decision on whether or not we should remove them from our system. From what I understand, it is a program that is deeply supported by our community. And if we want to move in that direction, it should be definitely a community conversation.
And I think it's clear. I mean, go ahead, Brian.
I was just going to add very quickly, I agree with everything that Manikka just said. And also, our police officers that do that, they're youth resource officers, so they also work in the youth centers. My own daughter, she learned to ride a bike, not because I taught her, because it's like driving a car and riding a bike with a parent, but the Cambridge police officers who were doing the youth research officers, J.J. Jones at King Open, taught her how to ride a bike. So we have to look very specifically at what's happening in our own community. And again, then based on that, the last thing I'll just add is I remember one of the first Black Lives Matter marches in Cambridge a number of years ago, and it was really organized by high school students and Black students from Harvard. And as they were marching down the street, the kids are like, "Hey, Officer Pacheco! Hey, Officer Whitey!" I mean, they were talking about Black Lives Matter and the problems with police, while also recognizing that the police that they know personally, they have a great relationship with. So we have to look at all of those truths. We can't simply start from a position of X should happen and how do we make it happen, but what does our community want and need? What's their experience? And exactly, again, what Manikka said about finding out and listening to the lived experience of our families around schools and policing.
I think that's a great way to end this program. It went much, much too quickly, but really, although we are in a tumultuous time and all eyes are on policing and how it is done across cities and towns in our country, we have to apply a great deal of introspection and say, how does it work here? And how do we want it to work? And how do we find that out by being able to reach out to the community in such a way we're really getting authentic voices and authentic input. I think there's much work to do. I agree with much of what has been said today, that it's not going to happen in a Zoom meeting, one Zoom meeting or one Skype meeting or one, again, of the many platforms that exist that we can reach across to get to people. It's going to take a lot more. And I look forward to working with each of you here on our panel and the community at large at forming what that looks like, getting that information, and then from that place being able to say, this is what we should do. It's been a pleasure being with you this afternoon. And before I say goodbye and thank you, I want to turn back to my co-moderator, Manikka, for her final thoughts.
Yeah, I'm really elated. I just feel like it's a privilege to be on in this conversation, rather, with MARION and with Brian, and hopefully we'll do it again. But before we go, I have one ask that I would love to put out to the Cambridge community. Many of you know that I was born in Louisiana, Lake Charles, Louisiana, to be exact. And a little over a month ago, my community was devastated. The community that raised me and shaped me and prepared me for leadership in this great city was devastated by Hurricane Laura. I've had conversations with some dear people in the community, and because of a partnership that is formed with the Cambridge Community Foundation, we have launched a relief fund for Hurricane Laura victims for Lake Charles, Louisiana. So I would love for our viewing audience and the greater Cambridge community to really consider donating to this cause. Up until last week, many people did not have electricity still. And because the weather is so hot there, people would sleep in their cars overnight just to find relief. It's a major issue. And because there's so much happening in the world, this community is not necessarily being uplifted. So please consider donating to the effort. It would be greatly appreciated. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Manikka, for letting us know. And people, it's really important that we take care of each other, even if those each others are not right in our city and town. So thank you for doing that work. And I know I will be participating, and I hope all of you will as well. Thank you, all of you. Zyla, thank you to the baby. To Brian, CORR, thank you so much for your time. Dr. Hope, thank you so much for your time. Again, it's always important to say to CCTV, their staff, Neil Alpert from my office, without them, we could not make this happen. So I thank them. But most importantly, I thank you, our audience, for joining us once again. We look forward to seeing you sometime in October to continue this discussion on COVID-19, how it's impacting the Black community, and also about police community relations in Cambridge. But for now, take care of yourselves and each other. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.